have an Irish joke for Evie in honor of St. Patrick's Day, and she's not even here. But she'll have to hear it from a distance, I suppose. Okay. If I can find out how this works. Father Patrick had one weakness as a priest. He hated the English. His favorite fire and brimstone line was, "And you'll go to hell with the English." He'd been admonished by the bishop more than once about this. Well, the bishop was visiting for Holy Week when Father Patrick again took aim at the English. He took Father Patrick aside after the service. "Father, your example of uncharitable language after so many warnings is intolerable. If you ever presume upon the judgment of God concerning your Christian brothers in Great Britain, again I will have to suspend you. Forgive me, Bishop. Forgive me. 'Twill not happen again. Never again will I disparage the English in this manner." All was well at Mass the next day and the following day. Father Patrick was celebrating Holy Thursday Mass and recounting the scriptural narrative of Jesus predicting his betrayal by a disciple. And Matthew asked, "Lord, is it me?" "No, Matthew, 'tis not you." And Peter asked, "Lord, is it me?" "No, Peter, 'tis not you." And Judas asked, "Blimey, governor, is it me?" Sorry. There you go. All right, so I really endeavored to make it this week through all of Galatians 2. Suffice it to say, I made it through 10 verses. We didn't even get to the hairy part that some people have issue with, that little incident that happens between Peter and Paul in Antioch. But we'll get there next week. So are you ready? Do you all have your scriptures out? Galatians, some form, or your listening ears turned on? Let's begin with chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. "Then after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. It was because of a revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles. But I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running, or had run, in vain." 14 years have passed. Whether that is 14 years after the 3-year period that Shaul spent in Arabia following his conversion, or 14 years including that period, is unknown and certainly debated. Shaul also indicates that he took Titus along with him, who was originally a guide for him during his journeys. Near the end of Shaul's life, he will write an epistle to Titus. It is safe to say that a long period of time transpires between the encounter of Titus and the Jerusalem leadership. Whereas Titus was probably a relatively new believer in Messiah when Shaul took him to Jerusalem, Titus is widely acknowledged in early Christian tradition as being the first bishop of Crete. Obviously, some major spiritual development had to occur between what we read here in Galatians and what we see in Shaul's later letter to him. Shaul takes the initiative to go see the Jerusalem leaders, as he may also be expecting more and more interaction with Jerusalem as his mission was expanding. Up until this point in his ministry, what Shaul did and what Jerusalem did were largely independent of the other. But now this was going to change. This was going to be Shaul's second visit to Jerusalem. And he states to the Galatians that his intention was to submit the gospel as he preaches it among the nations to the leaders for their approval. This is seen by the Greek verb, and my Greek is terrible at best, anatitemi, often translated as submitted, which can mean to lay something before someone for consideration or personal opinion. In submitting his gospel to the Jerusalem assembly, Shaul remarks that he did it in order to make sure he was not running or had run in vain. There are some, and I'm being careful not to look at anyone, although some ones might not be here, who make the assertion that Shaul's gospel and the Jerusalem Assembly's gospel may have been quite different. Shaul, at least, was determined to make the claim, at the minimum, that the message of salvation for both Jew and non-Jew is the same. Although the emphasis to a non-Jewish person when compared to a Jewish person may be different in key areas, given their different backgrounds, historical narrative, and experience. What perhaps made Shaul's gospel different when compared to some of the Jewish Moors of his time was that his message advocated that non-Jewish believers did not have to become Jewish to be saved. We must recall that the major premise of the first century Judaism was the widespread belief that one's ethnic status as a Jew assured a person of redemption. This can be seen in the Sanhedrin 10:1, which states, "All of the Jewish people, even sinners and those who are liable to be executed with a court-imposed death penalty, have a share in the world to come." That last part was taken from Isaiah 60:21, which says, "And your people also shall be righteous. They shall inherit the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, for my name to be glorified." This is something that could only be fully assured for a Gentile pagan by him renouncing his paganism and undergoing ritual proselyte circumcision. Shaul's emphasis on salvation by faith in Israel's Messiah, concurrent with the example of Avraham Avinu, Father Abraham, sought to overturn this embedded social concept that was largely created in reaction to some of the historical plights of the Jewish people. There was very real and widely accepted belief at this time, again, just to keep underlining that just by virtue of being Jewish, you were assured salvation. No other reason. And that's contrary to things in Torah and into earlier portions of the Babylonian Talmud. So it came to be this belief, but it was never that traditionally, or never that written in Scripture. Such a forced prohibition upon circumcision during the Seleucid invasion that we find in 1 Maccabees 1:60 and 61, which says, "According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks." While circumcising the males who had been prohibited to do so was a good thing for Jewish identity, it later resulted in many in contemporary Judaism often circumventing the divine mandate to Abraham for his seed to be a blessing to all nations. With these ideas in mind, Shaul makes a visit to Jerusalem to inform the leaders not only that the message of Avraham Avinu's blessing is what he preaches, but probably also to inform them that the nations are coming. He needed the approval of the Jerusalem assembly to continue in his work, lest Hashem's decree of, "In you all the families of the earth will be blessed," not be accomplished as well as it could. Fortunately, we see in Galatians 2 that the major leaders of the Jerusalem assembly do acknowledge Shaul's mission among the nations. This is verse 3. "But not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised." Immediately before discussing how his interaction with the Jerusalem leaders went, Shaul informs the Galatians that not even Titus was compelled to receive circumcision of the flesh. We must ask ourselves, why did Shaul take Titus with him to Jerusalem? Was it to see how the Jerusalem leaders would react? The process of going through circumcision would not just distinguish a pagan Gentile from a Jew, but it would also distinguish non-Jewish proselytes from pagan Gentiles. A Greek or a Roman convert to Judaism was widely not welcome among his own people once he had been circumcised. In lieu of the Maccabean revolt and the illegalization of circumcision by the Greek Seleucids, the Jewish religious establishment widely deemed that circumcision for proselytes was the only viable way for one to be considered an equal member in the Jewish community. One had to decisively take the sign in order to be a member of God's covenant people. Verses 4 and 5. But it was because of the false brethren secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty, which we have in Messiah Yeshua, in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain in you. Shaul indicates that even though he intended to go to Jerusalem to have a private interview with the leaders of the Jerusalem assembly, that some outsiders came into the meeting and disturbed them. Having just indicated in verse 3 that Titus did not feel compelled to undergo circumcision, Shaul now indicates why this subject even came up in the first place. He tells the Galatians that the matter arose because some false brothers had infiltrated their ranks, and that these fellows were apparently people who claimed to believe in Yeshua, but whose character may not have demonstrated them to have transformed hearts. What was intended to be a private business meeting ended up being something else entirely. It is important to note that this private meeting between Shaul and the Jerusalem leaders was never intended to be a public forum like the future Acts 15 Jerusalem Council. Outsiders got wind of the meeting and they entered in, hoping to cause problems or perhaps to push an agenda. These false brethren insisted that Titus be ritually circumcised, something that Shaul insisted was unnecessary and was for the purpose of bringing us into bondage. The bondage that these individuals advocated is contrasted against our freedom, which we have in Messiah Yeshua. What many Christian interpreters have unfavorably concluded is that the liberty or freedom of which Shaul speaks is being free from the condemnation of the sin of the law, and that these men were insisting that total adherence to the law was necessary for the salvation of non-Jewish believers. The idea that the entire purpose of Torah was to bring human beings into bondage is only one that is influenced by many modern and postmodern contemporary ideas of obedience toward God. I'm not sure if you've noticed this, but there are many within the church who fear that word, obedience. They run away from it, screaming, and they cover their ears and go, la, 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 la. Right? There's no such thing as obedience to God anymore. Yeshua did away with that. Now it's all freedom and grace. In every way. In much of the church today, too many people want as little to do as possible with obedience. This notion that believers in Yeshua need no set of guidelines to follow, like the commandments found in Torah, has a poor ideological base, especially when the thrust of the new covenant is that the Holy One will write his Torah onto the hearts of the people. This is made clear in both Jeremiah 31 as well as Hebrews 8. Even secularists recognize that human beings need law and order. Now you're going to hear that music, the law and order music. Consider the thoughts of James Madison, who, in the Federalist paper, number 51, wrote this: "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. But human beings are not angels. And even when we are forgiven and blood-washed believers in Yeshua, we still require instruction and a set of guidelines that we have to follow, even though we falter from time to time. The Torah provides a clear-cut set of guidelines to follow, and these should not be casually disregarded as today's church largely does. The view of the psalmist is that I will walk about in freedom, be'rechavah, for I have sought out your precepts. I will speak of your statutes before kings and will not be put to shame. By observing Torah, you walk in freedom." That was Psalm 119, 45 and 46. Furthermore, if sin is breaking God's law, as it says in 1 John 3:4, then is not sin what God wants us to be free from? It is empowering us not to break his commandments. Consider the admonition of John in John 8:34 and 35. Yeshua answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is the slave of sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son does remain forever." A believer who has been transformed by the power of the Ruach HaKodesh is not to commit sin, violating God's Torah, nor to be enslaved, to be in bondage of breaking its principles. A slave is someone who is in continual bondage to disobeying the Holy One, which includes forgetting his mandate as specified in Torah for his people to be a light to the world. The crux of the matter is this, and the thing that must be carefully considered by all of us. Is the slavery mentioned in verse 4 a reference to obedience to Torah, as it is so often interpreted? Or is it a sinful attitude opposed to Torah that keeps Jewish believers and Gentile believers from the nations in Messiah unnecessarily divided? One can keep the outward elements of the Torah and still be considered a lawbreaker by failing to uphold its divine mandate of being a blessing and a light to others, to serve them and to love them. Verse 6. But from those who are of high reputation, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Well, those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me. Here we get into some meat. In verse 6, Shaul comments on those he deems as having high reputations and that they added nothing to him or his ministry. Who were these individuals who added nothing? This is the key. Is it a reference to the 12 apostles or to those whom the influencers in Galatia might consider of high reputation? Various scholars of the ages have thought that Shaul was intentionally disparaging the 12 by this remark, and that the two groups of them were at odds over the issue of Shaul's purpose, his Gentile mission. Could it have been that his commandments were directed toward these unnamed influencers that Shaul contends were altering the gospel in Galatia? Without doubt, the influencers made appeals to the Jerusalem leaders, using them as claims against Shaul's evangelistic work. To this, Shaul reminds them that anyone from Jerusalem is as limited as he is. Was Shaul's purpose in Jerusalem to correct the leaders there on their position concerning his evangelistic mission among the nations? I think it is reasonable to surmise that Shaul viewed the Jerusalem leadership's approval of his gospel as vital to the success or failure of his missionary effort, because without it, Gentiles converted by it would be out of communion with the Jewish believers who were centered in Jerusalem. He needed their approval in some form. Shaul certainly wanted the leaders to know what he was doing. While not denying the leadership's role nor their importance, it seems that Shaul wished to communicate with those in Galatia that he did not see them as being faultless, something that the influencers and the people following them may have thought. They may well have held up these leaders in Jerusalem, such as James or Peter, as being completely faultless. To get the right feel for verse 6, we would do well to remember that Shaul was reporting on a very early scene in the development of the Messianic faith. The gospel message was just beginning to make a significant difference among the nations. The Jerusalem apostles, while chosen by God and certainly holding very high positions and authority, still had certain limitations as human beings. To seem some of what was happening was beyond their sphere of influence. Paul was called to the nations. They were centered in Jerusalem. Shaul, being an outsider to the Jerusalem assembly, had a unique perspective of a diaspora Jew, one who reflected the ideology of the Hillelite Pharisee, as well as being a Roman citizen. While the 12 largely stayed constrained to Jerusalem and the immediate vicinity of Judea, Shaul, by this time, had interactions and spiritual encounters among the nations that many of the leaders in Jerusalem lacked. Some have argued that by primarily remaining in Jerusalem, the apostles were not fully accomplishing the mandate given to them by Yeshua to go out to the nations. So when Shaul arrives in Jerusalem, it is no surprise that he would turn some heads and raise some eyebrows. Shaul is not being outrightly disrespectful toward the Jerusalem leaders in verse 6, but he does make some poignant observations to remind the Galatians that God does not recognize personal distinctions, at least when it comes to the notions of worth. The Greek phrase in verse 6, often translated as God shows no partiality, is better rendered, the face of man, God accepts not. This likely corresponds to the well-used Hebrew phrase of Shaul's time, nasa panim, to lift the face. That God shows no partiality toward human beings is a Jewish concept deeply rooted in the Tanakh. Deuteronomy 10:17, for example, says, "For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God who does not show partiality." The Hebrew here is lo yisa panim, nor take a bribe. He doesn't consider the face in Hebrew. And we read in 2 Chronicles 19:7, "Now then, let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Be very careful what you do, for the Lord our God will have no part in unrighteousness or partiality, umasa panim, or taking of a bribe." He has no part in considering the face. After remarking that God does not show favoritism, Shaul indicates, "Those, I say, who seemed influential, added nothing to me." The Greek verb he uses to describe this action means to add something to an existing amount, something that was already there that was increased. By making this comment, Shaul was not afraid to suggest that the Jerusalem apostles were not able to see the whole picture of what he had experienced. But on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Kepha had been to the circumcised, for he who effectually worked for Kepha in his apostleship to the circumcised effectually worked for me also to the Gentiles. And recognizing the grace to me, James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Shaul here indicates that the Jerusalem leaders approved of and agreed with what he was doing among the nations. His primary mission was to evangelize the uncircumcised or the pagan Gentiles, whereas Kepha's primary mission was to evangelize to his own Jewish brethren. But I do not think that we can take this statement to mean that Shaul would never have any interaction with Jews, or for that matter, that Kepha would not have any interaction with Greeks or Romans. The situation reflected here was to emphasize again the Master's divine mandate that the Besorah, the good news, was to go forth to all nations. There has been substantial discussion among commentators as to what Shaul specifically means when he uses the remark, "those reputed to be pillars," in verse 9. I'm sure there are many opinions in this room about that. This is a direct reference to James, Kepha, and John, the leaders of the Jerusalem assembly. Some take this remark as being a negative reference to these figures, whereas others see it as a sign of respect. Still others see that Shaul reminded the Galatians that they were reputed, and that should be taken to mean, "You have heard great things about them from those who oppose me." From this angle, reputed need not be a negative reference, but likewise not overbearing adoration either. And still others believe that Shaul's remark should only be taken in regard to the Jerusalem assembly, and not to the community of believers around the world as a whole. I can tell you that the Greek is not any more helpful in determining Shaul's intent. If anything, it muddies the waters even further. Because Shaul did seek out the Jerusalem leadership, presenting to them the gospel as he proclaims it among the nations. By virtue of him doing this, he recognizes James, Kepha, John as having authority that he does not have. These three individuals were, after all, the brother of Yeshua and two of the inner circle of the 12. They did command influence that extended well beyond their Jerusalem center. Finally, for today, verse 10, they only asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I also was eager to do. After approving of Shaul and Barnabas' work among the nations, they do ask them to remember the poor. Shaul is keen to emphasize that this was the very thing I made it my business to do. It kind of reminds me of the ghost of Jacob Marley, right? He says, mankind was my business. This statement lends strong support to the Jerusalem visit in view, being a reference to his relief mission that we see in Acts 11 and given by Yeshua himself during his mortal ministry. So here we see Paul once more supporting things that the master commanded them to do. All right, I know that seems short, but it was too much to go into the next couple verses because they're just too full of stuff. We'll do that next time. Dig into the stuff. Any thoughts on these first 10 verses? Anything that came to mind when you read through them?